Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your patience with us and waiting while we get our tech set up. Welcome to our webinar on tiered intervention and structured language programming for students with severe learning disabilities. We're going to start with some brief introductions. Over to you, Shannon.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Scullion. I am a seconded teacher from the Halton District School Board, and I have over 20 years of teaching experience in special education. I've worked as a resource teacher. I've worked in a classroom for students that have severe emotional and behavior challenges. I've worked at Trillium Provincial School as a teacher, and I am currently in the Resource Services Department at Trillium School. My role here is to support school boards across the province in our catchment area with students with severe learning disabilities. I have also worked at 2 Ontario school boards as a psychoeducational consultant. And I will turn it back to you, Wendy. So welcome everybody today to our webinar.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that introduction. If you could just proceed to slide number 2.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So my name is Wendy Farkas. I'm one of 3 resource services staff at Trillium Demonstration School. I'm an Ontario certified teacher and am seconded to the Provincial Schools branch from the Waterloo Region District School Board. My role is to support educators and school boards across Ontario who are seeking support for students with severe learning disabilities and ADHD. I also currently teach Empower, a Tier 3 structured language program for our online school. I'm just going to turn off my video feed as we navigate through the rest of the presentation, but we will come back online and turn our video feeds online toward the end for our question and answer period. We can go to the next slide, Shannon.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start our presentation today with our land acknowledgement. So Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis, from the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron to the Haudenosaunee and the Métis. These lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the 4 directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us.
Thanks so much, Shannon. The purpose of today's webinar will be to define and explore Tier 3 structured language programs and how they're essential for students with severe learning disabilities. We will begin with an overview of the response to intervention model through a reading remediation lens. We will briefly discuss Level 1 and Level 2 tier programming, but a more detailed and comprehensive overview of Tier 1 and 2 instructional strategies will be offered on Tuesday, November the 10th. Please register on our website and join us for Reading, a focus on supporting students with severe learning disabilities for classroom teachers. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you along with the slide deck later this week. We will also be monitoring the chat room, so please feel free to ask questions as you think of them and type them in the chat room. We will pause at the end of this presentation to answer any questions that you may have. The response to intervention model is a 3-tiered systematic approach, whereby high-quality instruction and assessment are provided to meet individual student needs. A tiered approach to prevention and intervention promotes sound, evidence-based practice to instruct all students. A tiered approach is based on frequent monitoring of student progress, analyzing assessment data, intentional focus, an intentional focus on the learning rate and level to identify students who are facing challenges and plan for instructional intervention. As pictured on the right, if provided high quality instruction, 80% of students should reach reading benchmark standards. 15% will require additional support, and 5% will require substantial intervention. And we're referring to the period of kindergarten to grade 3, where students are really learning to read and then reading for meaning. Tier 1 focuses on core reading instruction. Tier 1 is for all students, is preventative and proactive. Tier 2 involves targeted group intervention by a skilled teacher. Small group instruction and skill-based intervention focus on filling in and remediating gaps for students who are slightly below grade level. And Tier 3 involves intensive individual intervention. This intervention is highly systematic and involves explicit teaching of core reading skills. This is for students that are severely below grade level. Next slide. Thank you, Shannon. In the 2013 document, Learning for All, published by the Ministry of Education, references the tiered approach. The tiered approach can facilitate early identification of both students who may be at risk and students who may be in need of greater challenges. And it also ensures appropriate and timely intervention to address these student needs and significantly reduce the likelihood that they will develop more intractable problems in the future. The 2017 document, Special Education in Ontario, also refers to early identification and screening protocols for school boards. PPM 11, entitled Early Identification of Children's Learning Needs, states that each school board is required to have approved procedures to identify each child's level of development, learning abilities, and needs. Research consistently confirms that a supportive teacher who implements programs suited to children's individual needs and who provides immediate positive reactions about developing competencies and attitudes is a very reliable authority for deciding what a child can and cannot do. Now, having said that, we know that the responsibility does not rely solely on the teacher. You're not expected to identify a student that has a learning disability. Certainly, there are many stakeholders in a child's education. But the relationship that you have, especially in primary grades with your student, is going to be very important when you're identifying gaps that you're seeing and helping to remediate them. If you suspect that a student requires intervention or may have an undiagnosed learning disability, follow your school board's protocol and check with your in-school support team or administrator for support. Early intervention can change a student's life. Thank you, Shannon. Tier 1 is supplemental and enhances programming for all students. We can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So universal screening is a critical step to identifying students in primary grades that will struggle with reading. Research suggests that screening should take place once per year from kindergarten to grade 2. Assessment data guides differentiated instruction in the classroom. School teams should set a cut point to identify students who are predicted to struggle with reading development. It is very important to monitor these students regularly and track progress to inform future remediation plans and instruction. When selecting universal screening tools, schools are encouraged to look at recommended target areas for early screening. Shannon, if you could just click on the blue hyperlink called Recommended Target Areas for Early Screening. Thank you. Okay, so the table that you see here identifies some target areas between kindergarten and grade 2 that the classroom teacher would be looking for and benchmarks. So the students should be able to do these within those frames of time or by the end of those grades. Letter and reading fluency refers to identifying letter names. Phoneme segmentation refers to the ability to break words down into individual sounds, and we'll demonstrate that later on in our presentation. Nonsense word fluency measures a student's phonemic awareness. So by taking a nonsense word, they can't guess at it. They can't just memorize it. They have to use their phonics skills to be able to read and decode the word. Word identification refers to reading words, including multisyllabic and irregular words. And oral reading fluency refers to reading connected text. That is multiple sentences that are related to each other. Thank you, Shannon. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you so much. So next, we're going to talk very briefly about what a Tier 2 level intervention might look like. Tier 2 aims to remediate deficits for students who are somewhat below grade level. So you've identified in your classroom that the student is struggling to meet reading benchmarks. The deficits are not super severe. They're just slightly below grade level. And this is what we're going to do next. Thank you, Shannon. So Tier 2 instruction should be delivered to small groups of students by a skilled teacher. Students receive instruction 3 to 4 times per week for 20 to 40-minute periods. This is in addition to regular reading instruction. Tier 2 should focus on the major components of reading, including phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. Skilled teachers will follow a scope and sequence using a very systematic approach whereby students build skills gradually. Skills are initially introduced in isolation and then gradually integrated with other skills. Much like Tier 3 instruction, Tier 2 instruction is explicit and provides more teacher-student interaction. Students are provided frequent opportunities to practice skills and receive constant feedback. Some commonly used Tier 2 programs that we see a lot at Trillium as we're working with school boards that are being referred to us when they have students that require severe language remediation are corrective reading, reading mastery, and read naturally. These are a lot of programs that I've seen used. If you'd like to take a moment in the chat room below, if you click on the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat icon. Feel free to let us know and volunteer. If you know of a Tier 2 program that your school or your board is currently using, feel free to type that in the chat and share with us. Okay, and I think we can move on to the next slide. Oh wait, we do have some answers in the chat room. So we've got LLI, Leveled Literacy Intervention. Very good. Early Intervention Language Program. Remediation Plus. Yes, LLI can be a Tier 2 system. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. It's quite complex. We're going to talk a little bit more about that further on in the presentation, and I'll be able to explain why. But yes, it can be a Tier 2 program. LLI and corrective reading. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, thanks, Shannon. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So this table highlights the foundational reading skills students should develop between kindergarten to grade 2. So if you're a primary teacher and you're finding that students are not reaching these benchmarks, talk to your in-school support team and make sure you bring it to team and let them know that the student is struggling. Early intervention can really change that student's life, and it could really be key to success in their academic career. Thank you so much, Shannon. So when choosing a reading intervention program, Ensure that it includes the 5 main components of literacy, and that will include phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. There are many, many reading intervention programs out there. So it's important to do your research. And we can't really support one program or the other, but there are definitely a lot of great programs out there. And if you're working in a cert role or at a system level role, and you're currently looking into reading programs and reading intervention programs, ultimately what you want to do is just think about the learner. Think about the demographic and what those students will need. So let's take a quick look. Shannon, I'm going to get you to click on the first hyperlink, Reading Intervention Programs, a comparative chart.
There you go.
Thank you so much. And you can scroll down to the next page. This is just the legend. Thank you so much. That's awesome. So this chart we pulled from readingrockets.org, which is an excellent resource on reading. If you're new to teaching reading or new to teaching reading to struggling learners or students with learning disabilities and dyslexia. So this chart is a comparison of reading intervention programs. So this list actually contains 5 separate charts in the 5 different areas of reading. And you don't have to scroll down now, Shannon, but you can see on the screen pictured in front of you, this particular chart focuses on phonemic awareness. But if you were to scroll to the next chart, it would focus on another area, reading phonics. Sure. Thank you, Shannon. So let's just stay on the phonics chart for now, if that's okay. So on the left, it lists the program name, but also next to that in the second column, it lists the suggested response to intervention level. To the column next to that, it lists the grade level that it's meant to be administered in. And the column next to that, that is the instructional format. So that first symbol, the darkest symbol, that means that this program has to be delivered one-on-one with a licensed teacher or specialist. The symbol next to it, that middle symbol on the very first line, that symbol means that it can also be administered by a teacher or paraprofessional or volunteer. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a CERT or a special education teacher. It could be a classroom teacher, it could be an EA or a volunteer. And that last symbol over to the right means that it's meant to be administered through small group tutorials. The column next to that also indicates whether the program integrates instructional technology or like a blended online learning platform, kind of like Lexia, Core 5, and PowerUp. Those are online tools. And the column to the next to that identifies whether there's an embedded assessment piece. So it really does depend on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a tier 2 program, if you're looking for a tier 3 program, if you're looking for more of a catch-all program, and if you want students to be independent and be doing it online, also have to consider things like training. If you're looking for a tier 2 or tier 3 program, you're going to need to have a specialist trained, and there will have to be time set aside for the student to be working with that specialist. So they'd have to be pulled from class to go and work with that reading specialist in order to participate in that program. Okay, Shannon, if you could go back to the slide and click on the second hyperlink called Literacy Program Evaluation Guide.
There you go.
Thanks, Shannon. So here's another guide that we wanted to share with you. It's a little bit more up to date. This one was published in 2018, and it lists literacy programs that are not necessarily intervention programs. Programs are listed by name, grade level, and the 5 areas of reading, but there's some additional data on there as well. So for example, if you're looking for a program that includes level texts, or if you're also looking for a program that has a writing component in them, you can compare and find those programs here. So next we're going to be talking about tier 3 programming.
Wendy, we have a couple questions in our Q&A room. I don't know if we want to stop now and do that, or we can leave them till the end.
That's up to you. If we have time, we can stop and answer some questions.
Sure, why don't we have a look at those quickly?
Sure.
The first question regarding universal screening, are you saying that it is already set by the Ministry of Education, or that ideally it would be? Is the chart that you showed from the Ministry of Education, or did you just find one that shows best practice? In other words, has the Ministry of Education made this mandatory?
Okay, so good question. So the Ministry of Education does recommend that school boards implement universal screening. But what universal screening can look like in kindergarten up to grade 3 will be different from board to board, and that will be determined based on the board. So for example, I was talking to someone in the Peel District School Board the other day, and they don't administer like set universal screening to their primary students, to all students. But what they do is they gather data from all stakeholders in education. So they'll talk to the parents about any concerns that the parent might have. And if teachers are noticing that students are reaching certain benchmarks, their teachers know to bring it to team. And then they put a plan together from there and potentially consult with their speech and language department. But there are some boards out there that do universal screening right from the beginning, right from the primary grades. And they're specifically looking for students, they're flagging students that might not be meeting benchmark skills and flagging them. They're setting that cut point. And so that cut point means it's kind of like the point at which the student is falling below the mark. They sort of flag them for intervention, and they start being a little bit more proactive in remediating right from the get-go. So from board to board, it's different. So I guess that was a bit of a roundabout answer, but the best thing to do, honestly, is to check with your administrator, check with your in-school support team. If you're a member of the in-school support team, check with your team and talk about what your board's protocol is. But it is certainly best practice to consider universal screening, because we want to be more proactive. And the earlier that we catch these types of things, the quicker we can remediate and fill in those gaps for the student. Because being able to read and access the curriculum is what's really going to open doors for them and help to make their academic career more successful.
Thank you, Wendy. And there was actually just one question in there.
Okay.
Okay, so if you guys continue to use the chat in the Q&A room, and I'm going to move into the next part of the presentation, and we can stop again at the end of the presentation to answer any questions. So now we're going to have a look at what Tier 3 looks like, and in terms of the profile of the type of student that requires this intervention and the unique kind of programming that's needed, which is structured language programming in terms of benefiting this student. So what exactly does the profile of a student needing Tier 3 intervention typically look like? So essentially, there's a diagnosis of a severe learning disability. And that learning disability is very pervasive and really has a big global impact on that student's daily functioning. You can see the impact on them socially. They have poor friendships, they have difficulty socially problem solving and navigating the social world. They have lots of conflicts, or perhaps are very withdrawn and on their own. Often students in Tier 3 with severe learning disabilities have comorbid or dual diagnoses. So it's not uncommon to see a student that has a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, for example, that sort of more externalized behavior. Diagnoses of ADHD are almost go hand in hand with students in this tier. As well, we may see more internalized struggles and diagnoses around anxiety or depression. Self-esteem is often very, very low after years of repeated failure. And we know that students with learning disabilities are bright, so they're smart enough to know that they don't get it. So they constantly feel internally beat up. So that self-esteem is a big piece that can be very weak. In terms of their cognition, we know that students with learning disabilities have at least some sort of broad average cognitive scores. And so we will see that they are very bright. Students in tier 3 can be very different. They often have very spiky profiles when it comes to their areas of strength, and often their profiles are very different. So really trying to figure out what the student's profile is very important in our practice in supporting them. Academically, we start to see with severe learning disabilities that literacy area that really is not moving despite our best practices and all the supports that we're providing. Often we'll see it sort of plateau at the early primary level. And they can be several grade levels behind in terms of their literacy development. Mathematics, as kids get older, tends to become more problematic. Typically, kids with severe learning disabilities struggle right from the beginning with problem solving when they're required to work with the language, either inputting it or outputting it. But over time, you can see the breakdown in the number sense start to happen. As kids lack automaticity, that's really sort of a psychological process that needs to be remediated. So it starts to really impact their ability to quickly calculate things, and they start to maybe be able to be strong in one area of number sense, but maybe not transfer that throughout the strands in language or in math. So it starts to impact their performance across the curriculum. The other area that is really sort of obvious becomes the whole area around psychological processes. And I'm going to move to the next slide in order to explain this a little bit more in detail. This is really important, the psychological processes when working with students with learning disabilities. If you know what their psychological processing weaknesses are, that's sort of like the key to guide your programming and accommodations and strategies when working with this student. What we know about psychological processes is that they work together like pieces of an orchestra. So it's sort of a nice analogy to help you remember, but they must work together in order to have optimal functioning, and for that student to be able to access those higher level cognitive skills that we all know that they have. So there's essentially a breakdown and they're not able to always access those skills because of the psychological processes that get in the way. So a weakness in one area can actually impact strong areas. So for example, if a child has a weakness in processing speed, it could cause them to be inattentive, even though they may not struggle with attention, which therefore can cause maybe challenges attending to the language in a class discussion, even though they're strong language processors. So we really have to be aware of where the deficits are and provide strategies right at that area. Here is a list right here on the left of this slide of some of the examples. It's not an exhaustive list of the areas of processing that we can see most often in kids that have severe learning disabilities. Keep in mind that students with severe learning disabilities will often have multiple areas of processing that are very, very delayed. For the purpose of our presentation today, I'm going to have a closer look at the area, the processing weakness, or the psychological process of phonological processing. There's a great deal of research that shows that the nature of reading disabilities today Underlying those most commonly are deficits in phonological processing. So what does that mean? So phonological processing, when you see it reported in a psych ed assessment, will generally look at 3 areas. Our kids with the most severe learning disabilities have problems very significantly in all areas of this functioning. So phonological awareness is simply being aware of the sound structure of the English language and being able to manipulate the sounds at like a word level and a partial word level. So being able to know that equals hat, or being able to say how many sounds are in the word cow, or how many word parts you hear in cowboy, so cow and boy. So it's really being able to hear and manipulate and work with the sounds of the language. There's heavy scientific research that exists that shows that we can really remediate this skill in order to bring up a child's reading ability. Phonological memory is sort of like the working memory of sounds. So it's being able to put sort of on a working memory workbench all of the sounds and being able to manipulate them. A student that has poor phonological memory will have difficulty sounding out a word. And especially a multisyllabic word, because for example, if they're starting to sound out the word by the time at the beginning, by the time they get to the end, they've forgotten what they said at the beginning because their short-term memory can't hold it all together. So it falls apart. Rapid naming is the last area that's really looked at in terms of phonological processing. And this is more of a long-term memory. It's a child's ability to take in and code information so they can easily access it. And by information, we mean phonological information, so those sounds of the English language. Students that have a deficit in this area combined with the other areas have what we call a double deficit hypotheses, and they're the most severe types of reading disability and have require that students receive some really specific kind of instruction in order to remediate those skills. Okay, so here are some signs on this slide of what you might see typically for a student that has a severe learning disability right from the beginning of school. So if we were to take a student that's in high school and look back at their report cards right till junior kindergarten, you would see certainly a historical pattern of difficulties. And I'll just walk you through a little of this of what you'll see. So as we know, when we're in the primary grades, students are there and they're learning to read. So they're working with the literacy program to build their reading skills. And we will see problems in all of these things. Not all of them at one time with all students, but these are some of the typical areas that we can see right from the beginning. So problems with knowing the letters and the sounds, problems with blending. So knowing that at is cat and then the other way around. So segmenting, knowing that there's 3 sounds in the word fish. Sight word vocabulary is often low. These children have difficulty learning numbers and letters, days of the week, so some impacts on memory. These children may appear restless and distractible, even though underlying that restlessness is not any kind of attention difficulty, but perhaps academic confusion that leads to off-task behavior. They rely heavily on context and guessing when they're looking at a book. They have word problem difficulties, and their vocabulary, both spoken and written, is very slow to develop. You can start to see early on social difficulties because they can't mitigate and manage the language of problem solving with their peers and communicating with their peers. Sometimes they just can't keep up. The language is too much for them. Following direction and routine, and not because of behavioral challenges, probably be because of managing the language and processing all of that. As we move into the junior grades, It's assumed that now we know how to read. However, these students are still stuck back here learning how to read. So now we see the deep and broad challenges. Reversals continue. So reversals of letters and numbers, which typically should not be occurring beyond age 8 or 9. Now they're continuing. So, and like when you listen to them read, you're seeing a wider breadth of error types. So inversions, was for saw, or they may still be reading from right to left. They may transpose words, for example, reading past instead of pats. So they're transposing those last 2 letters. We can see some greater confusion in that transposition also happening in math, difficulty with the math back start. They're having difficulty, even though cognitively they may understand the concept, but difficult to learn new skills because the reading is getting in their way. Gross and fine motor challenges are often go hand in hand. We may see an increase in that attention and impulsiveness. Learning abstract concepts can sometimes be difficult. And then of course the social challenges continue, and often now we'll have an emotional piece around the self-esteem that starts to creep up. If we look into the intermediate and secondary grades, now things have become much more pervasive and persistent and seem to be permeating the whole child. A lot of these students are still way back here in the kindergarten primary area trying to learn to read. A whole lot of meaning gets lost in what they're reading and access to their curriculum if they're not accommodated for properly. Persistent problems with things such as reversals and error types. The vocabulary hasn't grown at the same rate as their peers. Learning a second language is extremely problematic for many. Effort becomes a problem, and sometimes that can be they are put forth excessive effort, and sometimes they are just completely disengaged. And in terms of social skills, we can see a lot of those continuing, and perhaps now some comorbid diagnosis around the social emotional pieces in terms of depression or anxiety. So as teachers, it's important, and we stuck this little thing here, is to have eyes in the back of our head and really take a deep look as we're going along at patterns in history, and use our response to intervention model in order to provide as much support as we can along the way. So when it comes to learning disabilities, we know that despite what we do, some kids continue to struggle. So a lot of their students that end up in Tier 3 have had amazing teachers and wonderful programs and all the right stuff. So they've been through Tier 1 and Tier 2, and they've had phonemic awareness training. They've done some phonics training. They've worked at level text at their level, worked at vocabulary development and comprehension strategies, but they still continue to struggle. And partially the reason, there could be lots of reasons, as we know that at this point their learning disability is pervasive, but a lot of it boils down in the intervention we know that we can do to help them, boils down to their psychological processes, which we know that many of them have multiple impacts in this area, and they're can be very severe and persistent, and now far-reaching into their academics, particularly reading. So keeping in mind that these students need more intensive support, and they will get this through structured language programming, which we're going to go into a discussion about that next. If you have any questions, I know this is a lot of information, please feel free to put them in the Q&A room, and we can stop at the end to respond to that. Okay, so we know that students with severe learning disabilities need heavy intervention, and this is done it can be done through structured language programs in order to remediate the reading. Here on the left are just some pictures to show you different types of structured language programs. There's not a lot of them out there in the field. And this one here, the Orton Gillingham, you may have heard of it. It's sort of the grandmother of all of them, and it had its inception way back in the 1930s and 40s. And since then, there's been some other programs such as the Wilson, the Empower, which we use here at Trillium, that have developed over time. And essentially, they all have similar components, which include, I'm just going to go over these briefly. So all structured language programs will have some main or core parts to it. So firstly, they will all have the teaching of the individual phonemes of the English language. We know that there are 26 letters in the English language, but there's actually not a one-to-one correspondence. And there's approximately 40, I think 2 to 46 phonemes in the English language, depending on the research that you're reading. Structured language programs teach segmenting and blending and how to manipulate sounds. They teach how sounds affect each other in words. So sort of like the A consonant E, those long vowel patterns, they teach that. They teach the relationship or the association between sounds, which are phonemes, and letters, which are graphemes. And this is, they teach explicit strategies for decoding unknown words. Structured language programs work on fluency and word recognition. They work on syllable instruction and morphology, and we're going to do an example right at the end that shows how a lot of this works. They work on syntax and grammar, vocabulary, as well as comprehension. So how is this done? So one of the big things about structured language teaching is how it's delivered. So these principles that I'm going to briefly discuss are found in all types or all the programs of structured language. They may not all be there, but essentially parts or partial ways of doing these components are included in most structured language programs. So firstly, they use direct instruction. So mostly everything is scripted that the teacher is saying. So everything's very controlled and directed and explained explicitly to students. Nothing is left up to inferential learning. Nothing is left to chance. What the student is learning is very systematic and explained. Everything is done as much as possible in a multisensory way. Each lesson includes listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Things are bi-directional, so you're always working from letter to sound and sound to letter, or letters within words to words within letters. It's very cumulative in terms of how things are presented. Everything is sequential and logical. And when you learn one concept, you build on that concept. So there's constant rehooking back to previously learned concepts and extended practice until things are mastered and automatic. Within most structured language programs, there's sort of a cycle of diagnostic assessment. So you assess, teach, reassess, teach, reassess, and you're constantly evaluating the errors and planning your teaching and intervention around that. One big thing, of course, with structured language programs is that anyone that is using them must be certified and must go for specific training that is reflective of that program. And just we're on to our last couple of slides here. At Trillium, this is a nice example, this graph of a grade 9 student and the growth that was achieved by that student. But at Trillium, we use the structured language program Empower. If you haven't heard about it, it's from Sick Kids in Toronto, from their Learning Disabilities Research Program. And they've been working for over 30 years scientifically researching this program and designing it to reach those core processing deficits for students with severe reading disabilities. And it addresses reading, decoding, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. And it teaches a lot of, 5 reading strategies, which are listed here. If we look over quickly at this chart of a grade 9 student from Trillium, the blue bar represents that student's scores just at the beginning of the school year, so starting in September. The red bar represents the student's scores after 1 year of intervention, so in June, so not even a year, so 10 months of intervention. The tests listed at the bottom are from the Woodcock-Johnson, which is the academic achievement test that we use at Trillium. All of these subtests here really look at sort of that phonemic piece to reading. These are sort of more the writing or the encoding, the spelling subtests, the math. You can see there's growth in all areas that's quite significant, multiple grade levels. An important one to point out here is how the math problem solving, how we said they struggle with this over time. And a lot of the reason is because that reading gets in the way. So once we remediate that reading and give them the skills, they now have access to the curriculum and can show how bright they are. Okay, so and a little quote that we have here is that nothing is more motivating than success once a student experiences appropriate instruction. So we do know that students, that tier 3 student really needs a specific targeted instruction. And after years of failure, even despite some really good intentions and good programming, with the right kind of structured language teaching, students can experience success and start to see themselves as readers and feel good about themselves. And this is our last slide here, just to try to bring it to life a little bit, some structured language teaching. And you can go ahead, Wendy.
Thanks so much for all of that, Shannon.
Yeah.
We are just going to run over a little bit today. We had planned to end off at 12:45, but we'll be running till approximately 1 o'clock. We understand that everybody is very busy, so if you do need to leave, that's okay. We are recording this webinar, and it will be sent to you along with the slide deck and all of the embedded hyperlinks for you to use and share with your colleagues. I'm just going to go forward and I'm going to demonstrate our structured language lesson so we can show you what it looks like in practice. We wanted to take a moment to show you a mini structured language lesson in action, and this is going to demonstrate how structured language programming is multisensory, deliberate, and systematic. Just as Shannon mentioned, we want to make sure that we're following a scope and sequence. We begin with our detailed scope or plan, whereby skills are taught in isolation, and then new skills are added as we go. Visual and auditory cueing are also very important in a structured language lesson, as it engages struggling and distracted learners and pulls them into the learning process. I will be providing auditory cues to Shannon, and we're going to be using Jamboard today, which is an interactive virtual whiteboard to facilitate our visual cueing. Just a little disclaimer, this is not an Empower lesson. For those of you out there that might be familiar with Empower, rather we've gathered techniques and ideology from various tier 3 programs to demonstrate today. So you may recognize some of the techniques, but we're changing language and we're switching it up. So Shannon, if you could please click on the Jamboard image to take us to our interactive whiteboard.
I would love to. I'm just trying to see where that image would be. Just one of the.
Just click on it. You should just
sticky notes.
Click
Yeah.
on it.
Okay, there we go.
Awesome. And I'm also going to turn my video feed on right now. It's very important for students that are in a tier 3 program to be able to see you. I mean, typically at Trillium, we have very small class size ratios, anywhere between 4 and 6 students in one Empower class. And typically students are in very close proximity to the teacher. So they might be sitting around a round table so the teacher can connect with them directly. We know this year is a little bit trickier and we're having to use masks and face shields. But if you're teaching online, you can absolutely choose to turn on your camera feed at that time so that they can see your mouth and see your facial expression as you're moving through the lesson. Okay, so we're going to start. I'm going to be the instructor and Shannon is going to be the student. So Shannon, please take a look at the whiteboard and can you tell me the name of this letter?
Oh, the name.
That's okay. What did I say, Shannon? The name of the letter? That's what I would say with my student.
On purpose.
So
the name of the letter is M.
Good job. Thank you so much. I'm going to tell you the sound that this letter makes. So listening, the sound is mm. Again, I'm going to tell you the sound. Mm. Now it's your turn to tell me the sound, Shannon.
Mm.
Good job. Absolutely. Now we're going to move on to using some strategies that we've learned to read a word. So this is where we're taking it right back to phoneme segmentation, as Shannon was talking about in the earlier on slides. And we're going to get Shannon to first know each sound. Then she's going to move to blending the sound, and then she's going to read the word. Okay, Shannon, take a look at this word. Don't read the word if you know the word, because we're going to practice our strategy. Okay, first we're going to know our sounds. What's the first sound?
Mm.
Very good. And notice how I am, we're going to be moving our cursor, or Shannon is moving her cursor from sound to provide that visual cueing. Next sound, please.
Ah.
Good job. Next sound or last sound, please.
Mm.
Very good. So you know your sounds. Now we're going to blend them all, but don't stop in between the sounds. We want one big long blend, okay? Are you ready? On my cue is going to be a snap. When you hear a cue, you're going to blend the sounds.
Man.
That's right. That's it. Good job. Now, can you read the word?
Man.
Very good. That's awesome, Shannon. Okay, let's take a look at this last word in our lesson for today. And now we're going to add in a little bit of morphology. So we're going back and we're explicitly teaching them to be able to identify parts of words or syllables of words. And we'll do that by counting the vowels. So Shannon, how many vowels do you see in this word?
2.
So there are 2 parts in this word. Let's look at this last part. Do you recognize that suffix?
Yes. Ing.
Good job. So Shannon, now that you know that suffix, why don't you get your marker tool out and just cross it off, because we've dealt with that. We know that suffix is ing. There we go. And now we're going to focus on the root word, the word that comes before. Let's use our sounding out strategy, okay? So first we're going to know our sounds. First sound, please. Now, A-R together, remember, makes a sound. Tell me the sound.
R.
Good. And last sound?
K.
Excellent. Now let's blend. Remember, don't stop. On my cue, which will be a snap, and blend.
Mark.
Very good. Now let's put it back together and read the word.
Marking.
Awesome. So as you can see, we've provided visual cueing by front-loading the material on an interactive whiteboard. It's multi-sensory in that students can engage with the material. It's interactive. And students can also use a highlighter or a pen tool to draw and create lines as they're blending through the word.
Okay, so I'm going to close this off. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. And we do have a couple questions in our Q&A room.
Okay, let's take a look.
Oh, no, they're still the same ones there, sorry. So no, we don't have any new questions.
If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A room or chat. While you're doing that, we just wanted to let you know that all of our webinars are founded in research, and these are some of the sources that we drew upon today and we wanted to share with you. Remember to sign up for our webinar next week, which is going to be kind of a continuation of this one, where we're going to be focusing more on Tier 1 and Tier 2 and practical instructional strategies in the classroom that will benefit all learners, but definitely reach those students that might be flagged for reading difficulties. Let's take a look. I think there's a question in the chat room. Can we download the presentation?
Yeah.
So we are recording this presentation, and we're also going to send you a copy of the slide deck. We'll email the recording and the slide deck to you with all of the hyperlinks and resources from the charts and resources we drew upon today, and we'll send it to the same email address that you used to access this webinar today.
Okay, I think that's all of our questions.
Feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions. Shannon's got our contact information up on screen right now. You can give us a call directly at those extensions. You can email us. You can also follow us on Twitter. We've got some exciting new webinars and snippets planned that we'll be announcing in late November. So feel free to follow us on Twitter, and we'll share that information with you as it becomes available.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know the days are busy. We're all got a lot on our plates. So thank you for your commitment to our students with severe learning disabilities. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye.